Hello, welcome back to LING 201, Introduction to Linguistics. I'm your instructor, Brett C. Nelson. Today we'll be finishing our semantics section of the course by talking about meaning and context. The readings for today were from Chapter 6 of Contemporary Linguistic Analysis, Sections 4 and 5. Announcements for this week. On Thursday, Assignment 2 will be posted to D2L and it will be due next Friday. While on the day after that, on Friday, this Friday, Quiz 5 will be due. That's been posted, so you should be working on it now. And that'll be covering semantics and today's topic of pragmatics, or meaning and context. But before we get on to that, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here learning in the area where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis, which is a name now used to refer to the city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which was signed by this land's stewards, who were representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Cree and Ktunaxa, as well as members of Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm a newcomer to this land. I come from Wabancha, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi, and I strive to learn more about the land, its peoples, their languages, and their history every day. Here at the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with the spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So the plan for today, we'll first be discussing context's effect on meaning, and then take a look at how people actually hold conversations by putting their sentences together within a certain context. This will include the entailments and implicatures the users of language make in these conversations, as well as a discussion of some of the general rules that conversations tend to follow. So as I mentioned at many points last week and already today, context plays a key role in resolving ambiguity and just is omnipresent. There's always context whenever you're using language. But within ambiguity, there's a couple types of ambiguity. There's lexical ambiguity, which is resolved, which is ambiguity at the word level, and that's usually solved by the other words within the sentence. And then there's structural ambiguity, where the ambiguity is because of the syntactic structure of the sentence. And this is usually resolved by other sentences within the discourse, or the context within the conversation of that sentence. However, there are also some parts of language which are built to be ambiguous on purpose. If language were built on purpose, but the very construction of these parts of language are ambiguous on their own. And this is probably because context, as I said, is almost always there to resolve it. So if context is omnipresent, there's always a context that a language or use of language is sitting in, then it makes sense to use that context to fill some meaning where otherwise it doesn't exist. A major example of these inherently ambiguous parts of language are pronouns, and we'll be talking about those in a bit. Some other bits of language that are ambiguous are adjectives, which again we'll be talking about. But first we'll start with pronouns. So pronouns, by definition, lack consistent and full meaning. This is the reason they're pronouns. They stand in for actually noun nouns. And so context provides what meaning that they're missing. So when I say I, it usually refers to me, Brett C., your instructor. But if someone else were to say I, the word I refers to that speaker or that user of language. Similarly, so when my supervisor would just say I, it refers to him, Dr. Flynn. So this word I doesn't always mean the same thing. It depends on the context, in this case, who the speaker is to fulfill its meaning. And just to fill out that paradigm, when you say I, it refers to you. And I can interpret that I doesn't mean me, it means you. And similarly, other pronouns can do this. You refers to whoever the audience is, right, instead of whoever the speaker or user of the language is. However, there are other pronouns which have even a different way to refer to who they're talking about. And this is usually going to be a person or a thing. They're referring to nouns, so it makes sense that they can refer to people or things. And the name we have for these pronouns which refer to other people or things are personal pronouns because they tend to refer to persons. So personal pronouns typically involve grammatical person. And so, again, that's what gives personal pronouns their name, is because the aspect of meaning that they do have is grammatical person. So what is grammatical person? Well, it's first person or second person or third person in English. So first person pronouns here would be I, me, mine, myself, or in the plural, we could have we, us, our, ours, or ourselves. The second person pronouns refer to the listener or the viewer or the reader rather than the speaker or the signer or the user of the language. So second person pronouns in English are you, your, yours, and yourself in the singular, while in the plural you have you, your, yours, and yourselves. So there's not much of a distinction in singular or plural, but there is one that we can interpret depending on the context. And because there's somewhat of a lack of distinction between singular and plural, some varieties of English actually have consistent use of a plural second person plural pronoun. And so that's the case with y'all or yins or you guys, or others that refer to multiple listeners or multiple readers or multiple viewers of a language. And then third person, it gets a bit more. So there's a more distinctions to be made among the third person pronouns in English. But in singular, we have a whole lot. So she, her, hers, herself, he, him, his, himself, it, its, itself, they, them, their, theirs, themself, and even more. This is a topic of much social discussion, is the development of neopronouns, which mean new pronouns, to add to this ever-growing set of singular pronouns in English, because people you use these pronouns as to mark their identity. So it makes sense to be specific with the identities that the pronouns can mark. However, once we get to the plural, there are much fewer, many fewer third-person plural pronouns relative to third-person singular pronouns. In English, most varieties of English only have they, them, their, theirs, and themselves. But you could see that each of these persons and numbers combinations has various different cases, one for uses in various parts of the sentence. So the first member of each of these sets is the subject case, the second member is the object case, the third member is the possessive, the fourth is the possessive when it's used as a predicate. In other words, when it's not modifying a noun, it is the predicate of the noun. So this is mine versus this is my phone. Mine is used after that be verb to indicate that it's predicating on whatever the subject is. So this phone is mine. And then there's myself, which is the reflexive. So each of these has various different ways to get from each of the various different cases. As you can see, some it's less, there's fewer differences. So you have you, two cases of you in the singular set. And whereas in she, her, you have two different cases, but they're two different cases of her, but they're on different aspects or different cases within that set. So she is the subject pronoun of the singular, third person singular feminine set, but the object and the possessive case are both her. This differs from he, him, his, and himself, where both of the possessives, the modifier and the predicate, are his, whereas the object case is him. So it's just English has done various different things to get to this set of pronouns for each of the gender, number, and person combinations. So each of them has slightly different ways to get from each of them to the others. But not all personal pronouns across languages always refer to singular and plural and gender. They can mark really any number of additional grammatical features besides person. Most of them, because they're personal pronouns, will vary depending on the person they're referring to, but it's up to the language to add or not add additional grammatical features to their pronouns. So, but with English and French, the pronouns in these languages also refer to number, case, and gender, where the gender is only marked for the third person singular pronouns, and the third person plural in French is maybe not in French. I don't know. But gender is only marked in third person in English and French. Whereas in Tunica, a language of the southern United States now, their pronouns mark number, so they mark not only singular and plural, but also dual. So when there's two of the reference, it has a different form that's different from both the singular and the plural. So that's why we call it singular, duo for two, and plural. They also mark gender on their second and third person pronouns for all numbers. So in addition to third person singular in English or third person in general in French, they also mark gender on their second person or you pronouns. So you have to take into account your listener or your reader or your viewer whenever you're speaking in Tunica as well, because the use of second person pronouns also indexes gender. Or you could mark relatively few grammatical features and just marking, for example, person and number in Kakjikel. So there are only 6 pronouns in Kakjikel, and those are first person singular, rin, second person plural, or second person singular, rat, third person singular, riha, and then first person plural, roch, second person plural, rish, and third person plural, rihe. So there's only 6 pronouns. They don't mark case and they don't mark gender in Kakjikel. Or you could only mark number and clusivity. And so this is what occurs in a language like Cree, spoken across Canada, where they mark number, so they have singular and plural. But within the first person plural pronouns, they also mark clusivity, which I've talked about before, but this is when you're talking about a we that includes your listener or a we that excludes your listener. And so that's called clusivity within the first person plural pronouns. So there's various different features that pronouns can mark, and that is kind of inherent to the form of each pronouns. But otherwise, the specific referent of each of these pronouns is never consistent. Instead, it depends on the context within the discourse that each of these pronouns is used to get the full meaning, to know who the pronouns are referring to. In addition to personal pronouns, there are other pronouns in language that are not personal pronouns because they don't always refer to the same person. Usually they actually just always refer to a third person thing, but they also have other types of meaning within them. So one of these sets are the demonstratives, which indicate a thing with a relative location that is distant or far from the speaker. So it depends on, again, the relative distance. And typically these are accompanied by gestures. So in English, for example, we might point to things that are here or there, or this or that, with different directions or different distances of the things we're pointing at. Another type of pronoun are the interrogative or relative pronouns. So who, whom, which, what. And they're called interrogatives because they occur within interrogatives or questions. They are explicitly asking for more information. Therefore, they're explicitly specified. They have less information than is completely necessary to get a specific referent out of the pronoun. They're actually asking for what that referent is. But these pronouns also act, if we think back to our syntax lesson, they act as complementizer heads to connect clauses. So the man who was wearing the hat, or the cat whom I had fed. You're not asking a question in this case, you're just providing a relativization point, a complementizer point, between the head, the cat, or the man, and more information that you're giving with another clause. And so that C head is acting to relativize that embedded clause to that noun head, which is why they're called relative pronouns. And then there's even more pronouns which are implicit or explicitly lacking information. And that's their whole point, is that it doesn't matter that they have that they're looking or pointing to something specific, because they aren't pointing to something specific. And these are things like one or someone or something or somebody. So any of these can be used just to say that, yeah, there's something that's doing this, but it doesn't really matter exactly who, so I won't give any more information beyond the fact that it's a thing or a one or a body. And so these are all different types of pronouns in English, which in all of the cases are lacking specific information, so they don't always refer to the same noun. They instead get that specific information to refer to a noun from the context in which they're used. And that is the key point of pronouns. So now that we've looked at all these various pronouns, we could talk about how they actually get their full meaning within that context. So those pronouns that have implicit instructions about how to find the specific referent are considered indexical pronouns, because they have a specific instruction. They have an index for to find the referent. And so what these implicit instructions are the character of the pronoun. So for example, for a first person pronoun, the character of this indexical pronoun is the speaker, the signer, or the writer that's writing or using that sentence. And so whenever these people use their first person pronoun, the character says, okay, point to whoever's using this, and that is who this pronoun is referring to. If they were to use a second person, the character would instead be the listener, the viewer, or the reader of the language and the discourse within that these pronouns are being used within. So for you, the character of you is the listener, the viewer, or the reader. And so anytime we use that, we know that the referent, what this pronoun is referring to, is the listener, the viewer, or the reader. And then for third person, the character is a bit less specific, and instead just points to something earlier in the sentence or earlier in the conversation, in which case it's called an antecedent, what came before. So the character for a third person pronoun isn't specifically the speaker or the listener, it is instead just something that came before, a noun which came before. So now pronouns aren't the only grammatical category which are indexical or have a specific character. Indeed, other grammatical categories can have these characteristics. One of these is the adverb. So adverbs can also be indexical, and specifically there are a couple types of adverbs which are indexical. And these are the temporal adverbs, which include today, yesterday, tomorrow, now, and then. And then there are the spatial adverbs, here, there, yonder, and maybe a few others. So these lack a consistent specific referent, like most other adverbs might have. Instead, they get that specific referent from their character and the context in which each of these adverbs is used. So the character for today says the day in which this utterance is being used. So this can refer to today, in which if I were to use today, then it means this day that we're speaking on, which depends on when you're listening to because it's a recorded video. But for me, today refers to the 29th of November 2021. But if you were to listen to this on a different day, or if I were to say this on a different day, today would refer to that day. And that's what the character of today is saying, is that it doesn't matter which day I'm speaking it, but all that matters it is this day that I am speaking it. I guess that makes sense. Whereas the character for the temporal adverb tomorrow refers to the day after the day of the utterance. I mean, yeah, that's what tomorrow means. But what this tells us is that it's not always a specific day. It depends on the day of the utterance. And once you know that, then you point to, God, this is so difficult. However, now pronouns aren't the only grammatical category which can be indexical and therefore lack a specific referent and that instead get their referent from the context in which they're used. Other grammatical categories can do this as well. One of these are the indexical adverbs. There are a couple types of indexical adverbs. The first of these are the temporal adverbs, such as today, yesterday, tomorrow, now, and then. And then there are the spatial adverbs, which are here, there, and maybe yonder. These adverbs, because they're indexical, also have character. So the character for today would be the day of the utterance. It's not a specific date. It only takes its specific date from the date that it's used. So today can mean the day I'm recording this, November 29th, 2021, but it could also mean November 30th, 2021 if I were to use today on that day. It could mean January 22nd, 2027 if I were to use today on that day. That's because of the variable character, or the characters consistently the day of the utterance, but the day of the utterance can change. Similarly with tomorrow, instead of the day of the utterance, the day after the day of the utterance. So tomorrow means November 30th for me, but on November 30th, tomorrow will mean December 1st. Similarly, on January 22nd, 2027, the tomorrow means January 23rd, 2027. So the specific referent of each of these adverbs differs depending on the day of the utterance. With now, instead of referring to a specific day, it's referring to a specific time of the utterance. It can be a bit more vague than that, but now, the character of now is the time of the utterance, whereas then would be the time of something else, maybe that was already mentioned within the utterance. On the other hand, we have the spatial adverbs, which tend to give a relative location. So the character for here would be a location that is relatively near the use of that utterance, and the use of this adverb, whereas the character for there would be a location which is relatively distant from the utterance when it's used and where it's used. Some varieties have a further specification of there, which is yonder, which is a location that is very distant from where the utterance is being used. So again, each of these adverbs never have a specific consistent meaning. Instead, they get their meaning from the specific context in which they're used. And that is why they are indexical. Furthermore, adjectives can change their specific meaning depending on the context. It's not necessarily going to be the same changes in meaning as the indexical adverbs or the personal pronouns, but you'll see that context can restrain the relative reference. No. Okay. Furthermore, beyond these indexical adverbs and indexical pronouns, we have context-dependent adjectives. So these adjectives don't necessarily change their meaning to the various different ways that indexical parts of speech can. Instead, the meaning is constrained to the specific context in which these adjectives are modifying a noun. So to start you off on this thought, if you think about the phrase everything's relative or it's all relative, you'll get closer to what I'm talking about with these context-dependent adjectives. And so the relativity we're talking about has to do with the relative scale of adjectives. For example, I could say there's a large hamster, and I could say there's a large lioness, and the meanings of large are the size that is implied by the largeness of each of these noun phrases, or the adjectives within these noun phrases, depends very much on the noun in which they're modifying. So a large hamster, because it's a hamster, you might not expect it to be as large as a large lioness, because the largeness is relative to the thing that they're modifying. A large hamster is going to be smaller than a large lioness because lionesses are, on the grand scheme of things, larger than hamsters. And probably a large hamster will still be smaller than a small lioness, because of the things we know about hamsters and lionesses. Lionesses are large, hamsters are smaller than lionesses, much smaller. So a large hamster, it's very much possible that a large hamster would be smaller than a small lioness, and especially smaller than a large lioness. Another example of our scalar adjectives, which are context dependent, would be fluffy. So Watson is fluffy versus the ducklet is fluffy. Because what we know Watson is a cat and we know a ducklet is a ducklet, we might expect that a cat that's fluffy is going to be more fluffy than a ducklet that is fluffy, maybe. But if I were to tell you that Watson is infinitely fluffy and ducklets are finitely fluffy, then you would know that when I'm saying Watson's fluffy, I'm talking about more fluffiness than the ducklet's fluffiness when I say the ducklet is fluffy. And that's just something we could do with our scalar adjectives. The relative scale changes depending on the noun that they're modifying, or they're predicating in this case. Therefore, the specific level on this scale is constrained by the context in which these adjectives are used. So it usually depends on what precisely is being described to give you the actual scale of the adjective that you're using. So those are all the context dependence parts of grammar, the grammatical categories that I wanted to talk about. But now we can move on to the types and various ways that conversations can guide meaning across sentences, phrases, words, and just the various ways that they fill or drive the meaning of our words. So context drives the meanings of large phrases, sentences, and even the whole conversation itself. In my opinion, language use is probably best analyzed within this context of the conversation. And indeed, there are a couple of fields of linguistic study that have to do precisely with the conversation. We have pragmatics, and then we have conversational and discourse analysis. Even more applied fields of linguistics and language studies can best be analyzed within this context of the conversation. And so you'll often talk about the things we'll be talking about today within conversations in fields that are relating language to advertising and marketing, because the way that a piece of language is perceived can very much drive different persuasive aspects of the advertisement. So if you find an advertisement in one context, the way you perceive it might be different than if you find it in another. And so we need to be able to describe these contexts and their various effects on that piece of language within that advertisement. So the first concept that I'd like to talk about within the conversation has to do with presuppositions. You may have heard of these, but we'll define these as the assumptions that language users are always making whenever they're using language. So sometimes the assumptions they're making are implicit rather than explicitly made by the structure and form of the language. When these are implicit, these are called presuppositions. They're the implicit entailments of an utterance that entail things just basically because they're spoken or used, rather than the actual structure, explicit structure of their sentences. Critically, presuppositions are the ideas that are entailed even if their sentence were negated, because negation is part of the structure of a sentence or an utterance, a sentence. And presuppositions are not necessarily part of that structure. Even if you're negating a structure, the entailment still holds. Therefore, they're signs of presuppositions. So, for example, Frodo knew that the ring was dangerous. There is a presupposition in the sentence. You could figure this out by comparing it to the negated form. Frodo didn't know that the ring was dangerous. The ring is dangerous no matter what. Even if Frodo knows it or if he doesn't know it, the ring is still dangerous. So the presupposition of this sentence, and when this sentence is uttered, is the fact that the ring was dangerous. So there's no way to negate that presupposition other than to really break the sentence apart into two separate sentences. You could say the ring was dangerous and Frodo knew this. Then you could start to negate it. The ring wasn't dangerous and Frodo knew this. But by having this sentence embedded, there's no way to actually negate the meaning semantically. Therefore, there's this implicit entailment that is the presupposition that the ring is dangerous. Another example could be that the King of France is bald. And if you compare this to the negation of this, the King of France is not bald. If you think about that for a second, you might think, well, there is no King of France, but there's no way to negate that based on these two sentences. The presupposition is that there exists a King of France, and he can be bald or not bald, depending on whether you're negating the sentence as a whole. But whichever option you have, you're presupposing that there exists a King of France because you say the King of France is bald or the King of France is not bald. And we'll break down why that is the case, that it is a presupposition based on our keys to presupposition. So there are a few keys to presupposition that really drive home these entailments, these implicit entailments that kind of exist despite their sentence being negated. The first of these are the definite articles or the possessives. So the, my, her, his, that, and their all drive presuppositions when they're used. By being definite, you're implying that there is the existence, a singular, or not necessarily a singular, but a definite existence of the thing that's being specified. So, for example, she can give you the details. The details are presupposed to exist. Even if you say she can't give you the details, you're still presupposing or implying that the details exist. You're just saying she can't give you them. In order to really, in order to break this down, in order to say the details don't exist, you have to use multiple sentences. The details don't exist, therefore she can't give you any. But that's the only way you can ever negate the existence of the details. Therefore, the presupposition here is that the details exist. A more complex example would be using a possessive. So, for example, I found your toque collection. If you compare this to negation, I didn't find your toque collection. You can think about what is being implied to exist. It is the toque collection. The toque collection exists and it belongs to you. Whether or not you have a negation doesn't change that fact, because it's an entailment that's implied based on the structure of the sentence. The only way to negate it is to actually negate the existence by pulling it out of that embedded position within the possessive and without the possessive and definite articles. So there isn't a toque collection, therefore there can't be your toque collection. But that's the only way to negate this. Otherwise, with this, uttering this sentence necessarily implies that the toque collection exists and it belongs to you. So the second key to our presuppositions are the factive predicates. And so factive predicates are verbs with presupposed sentences as their complements. Their complements is in fact a fact, which is why they're called factive predicates. So by being embedded, the negation of the predicate doesn't affect the complement itself. So for example, he knows that she is faster versus he doesn't know that she is faster. In either case, or in both cases, she is faster. It doesn't matter if he knows or doesn't. And this is because knowing is a factive predicate, which takes a fact as its complement. And by taking a fact as a complement, it presupposes that that fact is true. And so the presupposition of these sentences that have these factive predicates are that embedded clause. So she, in this case, she is faster is the embedded clause, so it is the presupposition of the sentence, he knows that she is faster. And the third and final key to presuppositions we'll talk about are the aspectual verbs. And so aspectual verbs come in various types, but the ones that are key to preposition are the ones that indicate that an action is ongoing or complete. So to start or to finish or to keep doing something. Each of these keep, start, finish, stop are aspectual verbs because they indicate an action is ongoing or complete. When you negate these aspectual verbs, you're only negating that aspect of that verb. You're not negating the embedded action within them. For example, my parents quit smoking. If you were to negate that, my parents didn't quit smoking. In either case, you're implying that at some point my parents were or are smoking. The only way to negate that would again be to really separate that out into kind of an unnatural speech pattern or language pattern and say, my parents never smoked, therefore they can't quit smoking. So it's a completely different proposition at that point, because the whole point is to negate the smoking rather than to negate the fact that they quit smoking. So in this case, the presupposition is that my parents did smoke at some point. By saying they quit or they didn't quit, you're still implying that at some point they have to be smoking in order for them to quit or not quit. So to summarize, for presuppositions, the structure of a sentence typically assumes a certain context and assumes the truth of a certain context. Because they can't easily be negated through just simple negation of their sentence, they are effective in advertising and in persuasion. They're also effective as being as lying in the case of lying or in deceit. By presupposing that something is true when you know that it isn't true, you are necessarily lying about it, and it's hard to negate that lie, because you can negate the sentence, and even if you do, the presupposition still exists. It entails a truth of that presupposition. Because of this use in persuasion and deceit, I think it's very fun to identify them, analyze them, and break them down, just as a way to kind of start discussion about why or what people are assuming to be true based on what they're saying, even if they aren't saying that they are assuming that it's true. The structure of these embedded clauses, embedded actions, the embedded noun phrases, assumes the truth, and so I think it's just fun to point them out, and I hope you do too. But we can move on to the next part of our analysis of conversations, and that is through the lens of conversational implicature. So sometimes an utterance in a conversation has meaning which is neither explicitly entailed nor presupposed. Instead, it relies on an implicature that is only interpretable within a conversational context. In other words, we mean more than we say. And so in order to analyze this, we have several important concepts. These are the conversational principle and the conversational maxims. So there's a good video that Tom Scott has made, and so I'll point to you here to watch that video. So the first of these these concepts is the cooperative principle, which guides most conversations. And so with the cooperative principle, the rule is basically to make your contribution to the conversation as required by the goal of that conversation. So you're cooperating with the other members of that conversation to achieve the goals, the implicit goals of that conversation. And within this cooperative principle, there are 4 guiding maxims. There's the maxim of quantity, where you say just as much as required. You don't say too much, you don't say too little. There is the maxim of quality, where you don't lie, or you tell the truth, basically. Don't lie or guess without saying so. And so that contributes to the goal of the conversation by not misleading people within the conversation. You're telling the truth, therefore you're trying to get to a truthful resolution of the conversation. The third guiding maxim is the maxim of relevance or relation, where you are to be as relevant as necessary to the conversation. Don't just go off the rails into something else. Keep within the what's being related by the other members of the conversation. Be relevant. And then there's the maxim of manner. You are to be clear, orderly, and precise. Don't use specific jargon or that's not shared with other members of the conversation. Don't be overly verbose in your words, and so use the appropriate lexicon for that conversation. That's all entailed within the conversation, the conversational maxim of manner. And so, but these aren't hard set rules. You can break these maxims, or you can go around these maxims in order to make conversational implicatures. So when we violate the maxims, it's usually to imply something other than what is said, and sometimes it's even used for comedic effect. And even more, it can be used to imply that we do not wish to cooperate. If you're purposefully breaking the maxims, it may be because you're not following the cooperative principle. And so you have to imply that by breaking your maxims. For example, there can be a news headline. This is an actual thing. Animal escapes from enclosure at zoo during hurricane. It's a hurricane. It's a local emergency, if not a national emergency. So to put this as a news headline that an animal escapes, that must be a huge part within the emergency, right? Well, not if it's a deer. Like if a deer escapes, there's plenty of deer around everywhere. So what's the what's newsworthy about a deer escaping, other than the fact that it's an animal escaping from an enclosure at the zoo during a hurricane? And so what this is doing is flouting the maxim of quantity. You're not being specific enough that it tells enough information. Because if you're like me, you might assume or infer that you're talking about like a dangerous predator or a carnivore or a large animal that could like trample things, like you have in Jumanji. So you could have like a lion, a tiger, or an elephant escaping from enclosure. That seems like a very newsworthy article to post during an emergency like a hurricane. You don't expect it to be a deer because of the context of this article being posted during a hurricane. Why is that particularly newsworthy? And in fact, if you were to analyze this, you might come to the conclusion that they're being purposefully unspecific in order to get more clicks, which is kind of I think it's a horrible thing to do during a local emergency. In this case, it was a zoo in New Orleans during a hurricane. News headlines are very well known for breaking and flouting the maxims just to get more news clicks, and they call this clickbait. Another example of the flouting or breaking of a maxim to imply something other than what's said would be in this case, where a mother is asking their child, "Have you done your homework?" And the child says, "My bicycle is broken, Mom." So if you think about this, well, what's that? How is that relevant? And that's because the son is flouting the maxim of relevance. The reason he's doing this is because he doesn't want to talk about his homework. And Mom brings up homework as a topic of conversation, but the son quickly talks about something else in order to avoid talking about Mom's desired topic of conversation of homework. For various reasons, he didn't do his homework, he forgot his homework, his dog ate his homework. Whatever the reason is, by flouting the maxim of relevance by talking about the bicycle instead, he's saying he doesn't want to talk about homework. So this is something that can happen very often, just to avoid a particular topic of conversation. The final example of a flouting of the conversational maxim I'll give here is this one, where Allie is talking to someone named Bess, and Allie asks, "I hear you went to the opera last night. How was the lead singer?" And then Bess responds, "The singer produced a series of sounds corresponding closely to the score of an aria from Rigoletto." So you might think this is, it's relevant. You're talking about what the singer's doing, but what this is doing is flouting the maxim of manner. What did we say the maxim of manner was doing? The maxim of manner tells us to be clear, orderly, and precise. And so this isn't exactly clear, orderly, and precise. And whatever Bess is doing is not really being faithful to what the question that Allie is asking. How was the lead singer? Typically, when you ask this type of question, this is a possible response, but typically you're looking for a kind of a grade of how the lead singer sang. Were they good? Were they bad? Were they okay? Not literally what the lead singer was doing with kind of over-verbose language. The singer produced a series of sounds corresponding closely to the score of an aria from Rigoletto. You could say that in an even shorter way that isn't overly obverse. The singer was singing an aria from Rigoletto. So you can shorten it in one way to avoid flouting this maxim of manner, but that's still not answering the question. The question is asking, were they good or bad? And so Bess could have just said the singer in singing Rigoletto was great, or the singer was terrible. That's being more cooperative in the conversation that Ali and Bess are having, because Ali's looking for an answer that has to do with the relative grade of the singer, not precisely what the singer was doing in corresponding closely to the score of an aria from Rigoletto. Why Bess would do this, I'm not too sure. I would need a bit more context to analyze this. And maybe Levinson 1983 does analyze this a bit more. But with just this context, I can't really say what the exact purpose of Bess doing this is. But what it does indicate is something other than what's said. Maybe it was so bad that Bess doesn't want to talk about how good the lead singer was. So Bess is just super specific and overly verbose. It may just be a joke, and so it might be comedic effect. And it may just be an overall unwillingness to talk about the opera. And then, so by saying this, it might just shut the whole conversation down by saying, I don't want to talk about this. So there are various reasons why someone might flout a particular maxim. And these can be fun to analyze as well. There can be lots of humor, analysis of humor with these. Sarcasm usually flouts a manner of conversational maxim. So these, there are lots of analyses of these maxims in relation to humor. But that's all I wanted to talk about today. So I'll leave off with the announcements for this week. On Thursday, I'll be posting assignment 2 to our D2L page, and you'll have at least a week up until the following Friday, a week from this Friday, technically, to complete that, which has to do with syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And then on Friday, however, quiz 5 will be due via D2L, which has to do with just semantics and pragmatics, the lectures and the readings. So get that in by Friday. Other than that, the readings for next week, there are none. This is the last lecture of the course that will be assessed. So focus on your assignments, both assignment 2 and assignment 3. But I will have a lecture on Tuesday, in which we'll be discussing various specific applications of linguistics. As I said, nothing will be assessed, so focus on completing the assignments, and I'll just be providing lecture that will give you more information about what we can do with linguistics and the tools that we've developed in this course. Also next week, we'll have a workshop for the completion of assignment 3 on the last day of class of this semester on next Thursday. Other than that, on Thursday as well, your second article evaluation is due. If you're doing that for extra credit, be sure to get that in by next Thursday, December 9th, our last day of class. Other than that, that's all I have. So thank you for listening, and I hope you'll come for our last lecture next week. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and you'll hear me next time.